Okay, so today I want to talk about one of the many awesome Star Wars magazines that exist out there in Star Wars land. Not talking about Star Wars Insider though, not talking about Star Wars Gamer or Galaxy or any of the others you may be thinking of. I want to talk today about Star Wars Kids. Now, Star Wars Kids gets a little confusing because there were actually three different magazines known as Star Wars Kids. And it gets even more confusing because two of the versions of Star Wars Kids were both published by Scholastic. Another wasn't, but that one that wasn't had lots of recycled content from the first volume of Star Wars Kids. And so, to make matters even worse, they all sort of look alike, all essentially have the same sorts of features organized and edited in very similar fashion. So it gets kind of confusing to know, for instance, if you were just to sort of see random issues in a used bookstore or something or online on eBay, what's what. There were 20 volumes altogether, and I can just sort of quickly sort of show you all of them right now. The basic idea was that, and they all had a number of different features, sort of Q&A with characters, just general sort of fact sheets, lots of comics and various sorts of activities and things. 20 volumes focused around each issue, sort of a feature around an individual character. So here we go, C-3PO, Gotta love Lando, give us more Lando, please. Boba Fett, Obi-Wan, the Grand Moff himself. We'll come back to him in just a second. Jabba, gotta love Jabba. Biggs, R2-D2, the Emperor, Yoda, of course. Gotta have Greedo. Gotta have Greedo. If you're selling more products to kids, you gotta have Greedo. Admiral Akbar, and finally, and this, by the way, wasn't entirely in chronological order, but Bib Fortuna. What was really neat about these things is that, like I said, they had some comics in addition to sort of just various game activities and sort of Q&A and general sort of fact sheet information. Some of these comics later get reprinted in the essentially second volume of Star Wars Kids published by Fan Club Inc. What's really cool, though, is that if you can't find either version of these magazines, these comics get reprinted in the Dark Horse Omnibus Wild Space, which is another reason why those Wild Space Dark Horse Omnibuses, I've talked about them in other videos, are so worth getting. They collect all these random little bits of things that were sort of totally obscure that most people didn't even know existed at the time. Everything from comics and Star Wars Kids magazines to comics coming out of Applejack cereal. Seriously, the Wild Space Omnibuses, while unfortunately out of print, are totally worth hunting down and picking up. Amazing collections that gather lots of this stuff. Now, again, I love having everything. So I've got the Wild Space. I've got both volumes of Star Wars Kids. I like to have it all. But if you can't find it, just get the Wild Space Omnibuses. Now, the reason there were 20 of these things is because what Scholastic was essentially doing, and incidentally, this was published between 1997 and 1999, is they viewed this in some sense as a supplement to their Star Wars Missions series. Now, the Star Wars Missions series also published around that time, and also 20 volumes, because again, for every volume there was a corresponding magazine. It kind of came as the package of things that you bought when you signed up for this product. Star Wars Missions is something I'll do a whole video on someday. These were fantastic role-playing guide games. Basically, you got little sorts of short stories, then with dice instructions and things like that. So these were really, really neat introductions to kids to Star Wars, into RPGs, and they're wonderful things for us adults as well. I mean, that's the thing. Hey, it may be Star Wars Kids magazine, but this stuff is worthwhile from an EU perspective. I mean, some of these stories are just great. I mean, it's a fun trivia. Did you know that Dengar essentially has his own Star Wars EU Legends book? Now, it's a tiny little book, and it's basically just a role-playing guide adventure. But there you go. Another fun trivia, right? I mean, tell all your friends that just follow the Disney canon that Lucino's Tarkin is not the first time that Grand Moff Tarkin has been on the cover of a Star Wars book. Here you go. Here you go. Again, it's a small RPG adventure, but there he is. But by the way, the fun thing there is it doesn't stop there. If you really want to wow him, let him know that he's also on the cover of another Star Wars EU Legends product, Last of the Jedi, which is another amazing series that I'll do another video on at some point. So here you go. Scholastic was publishing the Mission series, and they said, hey, as part of the package, we're going to publish this magazine with supplemental info as well. And the magazines are really fun. I mean, in addition to the comics that you're going to want to have if you want to know more about the EU, but I just love them because of the sort of the time capsule, right? I mean, you get to learn about other things happening in Star Wars land at the time, including, for instance, advertisements, right? Old Star Wars content is some of the best places to track down more obscure Star Wars content that you didn't know existed. I mean, for instance, if you thought that Star Wars was just about, the Star Wars EU was just about some adult novels and comics, and didn't realize that there were actually two books written under the label of Science Adventures, well, here you go. You've got an advertisement for these things, which, by the way, are worth picking up, and which, unfortunately, I sort of conclude on something of a cliffhanger that doesn't get resolved. Yet another reason why Disney should allow the EU to continue, so we can sort of close some of these gaps. But there's other fun things too. You know, fans were able to write in with Q&A, and so in some sense, it's kind of like an early Star Wars forum. It's a chance for you know, what in effect at the time was sort of the holocron keeper to answer questions. You know, really important questions too. I mean, we're talking 1997 to 1999. We don't entirely have the prequels yet. We've got a sense of what's coming, but there are important questions in there like, how old is Darth Vader by the time of A New Hope? These sorts of questions, these sorts of very persnickety but very helpful, important questions are getting asked and answered in something as obscure as Star Wars Kids. Now, after Star Wars Kids came Star Wars Kids Again, right, Volume 2, and it wasn't published by Scholastic this time. It was published by an outfit called Fan Club Inc., or Fans Club Inc., something like that. It only ran for about 8 volumes. I think there was an additional sort of supplemental sampler volume. You can still sometimes find these in single issues online. Gonna have probably a harder time finding someone selling them all in bulk, but they may or may not be worth tracking down depending on how big and expansive you want your collection to be. Like I said, a lot of the comics and things are things that you can either find in Wild Space or in the first volume here. So you don't really need to get both volumes unless, again, you love that sort of supplemental information, seeing the advertisement, seeing more about Lucasfilm at the time, learning more about what were the questions being asked by fans at the time, what were the answers, have those answers potentially changed, have things about the prequels or other elements of the EU sort of forced any sort of necessary retcons and whatnot. I think that's really interesting information. Just after the second volume concluded, Scholastic picked the Star Wars Kids franchise back up with what's in effect sort of a third volume. And the reason they did that was not unlike their first volume, which was a supplement to the Star Wars Mission. Scholastic had started publishing these episode adventure games, and the same sort of thing. Supplemental RPG content with ideas for sort of how to play these games out in RPG fashion. I've talked about this before, but in each case there were corresponding game books. The game books are considerably less important to understanding the EU. I mean, they're everything from the this is where the content is. This is where sort of the instructions in terms of how to play the game is. They sort of combine that a little bit better in these. But in any event, we'll do another video on these specifically down the road. But the idea was that the third volume was in essence supposed to be a supplement to that. So if in the very late 90s you're picking this up, you're also getting the corresponding Star Wars Kids magazines. Just a few years later, after Episode 1, if you're picking these up, you're also going to get Volume 3, and I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, that's the basic rundown on the Star Wars Kids magazines. Sort of a fun, obscure thing to pick up. You know, do you entirely need it to understand much about the EU? Not really, but is it a fun piece of Star Wars history? Oh, absolutely. And like I said, you're gonna learn about things there that I just don't think come that often. I mean, open up any random magazine on the inside, right? Advertisements for things like, the Star Wars Trilogy scrapbook. I mean, did you know that existed? A lot of the content here too. I mean, by the way, here's some of the comics to give you kind of a sense of what the art is. It's not cutting edge, but some of the stories are more important and better than others. This one happens to be about Rebel Thief, which again is something you can pick up in some Dark Horse omnibuses. The one final thing to note is, like, in addition to sort of seeing some of the advertisements and things, which again are always sort of great ways of getting leads on what other sort of Star Wars material exists, some of these Q&As that would be published would oftentimes be answered with sources. And so someone might say, whoever it was that was writing this at the time is saying, oh, well, Darth Vader is, say, 55 years old by this point or something, right? Well, based on XYZ reference guides. And there are reference guides in there that you may or may not know about. I mean, one of the things that's pretty prominent at the time is something called Star Wars Chronicles, and we'll talk about that in another video. There's Star Wars Chronicles and Star Wars Chronicles, the prequels, which were kind of neat combinations of reference guides, encyclopedias, making of lots of things that sort of went into the various films. Yet another additional fun, exciting, and obscure but important part of the Star Wars EU Legends canon continuity. So that's it for today, Star Wars Kids. Check it out, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And look forward to some future videos on the Star Wars Mission series and on the Star Wars Episode 1 and Episode 2 adventures, although there was no corresponding magazine for Episode 2. And yeah, we'll talk to you later.